Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. Hi, everybody. In the Facebook group a couple of months ago, one of our members asked about adding food codes, addendums to their contracts, and if anybody was creating those. And I said I would get back to her, and now 2 months later I am, and here we are. But I did post the contract that she sent to me, the addendum that she sent. So you all should be able to find that in the Facebook group. I'm not going to pull it up now, but Lisa, Tyra, and I here are going to talk about it here and answer any of the questions that you have. So please ask questions if you've got them about food and beverage contract clauses. So, ladies, how are you?
Great, thanks.
Real good. Thanks.
I wish all three of us would be equal size here, but we'll move this around. So, food and beverage, it's different now with COVID, or is it different with COVID? I want to start with the question first of, when contracting events right now, there's been a lot of people postponing their events and changing them, but people are hosting them. Have you seen any changes in just food and beverage clauses in general in hotel contracts? At least I'm going to start with you on that.
Yeah, as an attorney that represents the hotel side, I so far am not seeing specific new clauses relative to food and beverage and COVID at the same time. I'm certainly seeing clauses relating to COVID in general, but nothing specific regarding food and beverage, at least so far.
What about food and beverage minimums? How has that been handled late because of whatever going down?
You know, what we're saying to everybody is any meeting is better than no meeting. And so my hotel clients are very willing to be flexible with their customers to adjust food and beverage minimums based on revised attendance, those kinds of things. So certainly that is something that's out there, at least for the short term. Right. They're willing to be flexible on that because, more and more meetings are becoming hybrid. And so you're not going to have as many people there to eat. And they would rather have somebody there than nobody there.
That's very true. And Tyra, now you're in the hot seat because I can move your face over there. What have you seen differently at all from your perspective as a planner attorney? Right?
Sure. Well, like Lisa, I think flexibility is really the name of the game right now because, in addition to meetings going hybrid, even with just the social distancing requirements in most facilities, meetings are smaller, even if they're face to face. So I think having the flexibility, and those food and beverage minimums, working with facilities that are willing to forgive or renegotiate those food and beverage minimums. I'm seeing some of that where, it used to be those contract clauses were pretty hard and fast in terms of food and beverage attrition. I'm not seeing a lot of difference in the food and beverage clauses or that kind of thing, other than somewhat in the service in terms of how many people are being served, per table, how the seating arrangements, not having buffets, for example, because of COVID. I'm seeing some requests for, not having other groups in the same, for example, serving off of breaks in similar areas, pre-function areas, that kind of thing. There's been some discussion about, will we have the same servers throughout our entire conference so that it minimizes the COVID risk in terms of, do we have different people coming in and out of our conference, or, at least it's the same people, the same servers. So some things like that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I'm not seeing clauses specifically about it, but I am seeing, as Tyra mentioned, differences in how service is happening. And, buffets are going away, or if there's a buffet, the individual can't serve themselves. There's a staff member serving. And of course, all those kinds of changes impact the costs for the venue. And so there's got to be negotiation about who's going to absorb those changes in costs, because that does make a difference. And again, self-serve breaks are going away. You've got to have things where somebody's handing you something rather than self-service. So that will impact those kinds of things.
And have you seen, I think everybody's in that let's work together kind of mode, but are hotels eating those fees, or are they passing them on, or has it been a combination?
I think it's a combination depending on a million factors.
Okay. Nothing's super big at this moment. Well, maybe in Florida right now. So let's talk to that statement that she put together. It was to me, and I'm going to say that what I did, I actually put it out there into a Facebook group of caterers. And I said, hey, have any of you been presented this type of addendum to your contracts? And how do you respond to this contract? And a handful of them are like, no way in heck will I ever sign that, run away from this completely. I don't want them as a client. So I presented that to the two of you, and we could, let's talk about food code in general. So Lisa, when we talked about this last week, we talked about how the food code is already been there. And I'm going to put me back up here real quick. Food safety has always been there, and the food code has always been there. And you can't have a food service company without following the regulations behind the food code and having certain things there. But in a segment that I asked planners, I said, how many of you had asked about food safety practices prior to COVID? And 71% of them had said never. And you could take that two ways, as this is a positive that we trust the hotels and the convention centers, but then it also, from Tyra planner perspective side, what do we need to be asking, and where should this fall into? So Lisa, I want to have you talk about that first from the venue side and protecting them and where they stand with the food code.
Sure. Well, from the venue side, as you said, the venue is always responsible to comply with all the food code, all the regulations, temperatures and service and all those kinds of things. And they get regular inspections. Now, it depends on where it is, how much budget there is for those inspections, but they get inspections. They have scores that they have. They have brand standards of things that they have to do as well. And so it kind of goes without saying, you don't have to put something in your contract that says you will do X, Y, and Z. And, the food code that you sent, I think goes a little bit to the extreme. And I can understand why your catering friends said they didn't want to do that. I think my hotel clients would say the same thing. We're already obligated under these clauses to we're already obligated to comply with the food code as it is. And we can't make special arrangements just for one group. And so if a group is asking for something above and beyond what the law already requires, I think your venue is going to be hesitant to do that. They're going to be hesitant to let you into their kitchen to see that you're doing what they want you to do. They're probably going to say no to those kinds of things. And Tyra's going to speak to objective things that she would recommend, which I thought were really good ideas. I just wanted to say that another thing to think about is, as a planner, be cautious about assuming a duty. And what that really means is if you take on responsibility for something that it is not your regular responsibility and you do a bad job, you can be held liable for that. So if you were to put a clause in your contract as to how the venue has to handle its food in some particular way, and somebody gets injured or sick or whatever, and they can then point to that and say, you told them to do A, and I got sick because of A, and therefore you are liable to me because you set the standard and the standard wasn't good enough. So I think as planners, it's important to require the venues that you work with to be, you can ask them to be in compliance with all laws. They're supposed to be in compliance with all laws anyway, but be careful adding additional things, because your venue is going to be reluctant and it may expose you to more liability. And I think I should then say, Tyra, you jump in, because the things you said before we started talking today, I thought were great on how a better clause could be fashioned.
All right. So Tyra, there you go.
Thanks, Lisa. And I think Lisa makes a really good point about, not adding to planner or to group liability risks there. But yeah, I mean, my main point was, let's not try to step in and be experts where we're not. I certainly understand the spirit of the food code in wanting to make sure, that we're as safe as we can be, especially in the time of COVID. And, having been a former catering manager in a hotel myself, I know that, not all chefs and not all kitchen staff are created equal, even in hotels. But the liability issue is a good one. And my preference generally always in dealing with contracts and contract clauses is, when you can, instead of trying to create your own, try to tie it to some existing standard. And so in this case, maybe, if you feel you need to create a clause, or you need to tie it to something, as Lisa said, hotels, caterers, restaurants are already obligated to meet the legal standards that exist for food safety. They're already out there from the health department, and the other entities that are out there. But, there are things like the serve safe standards, so, Tracy, I know you have some language that asks about the health department, score that restaurants and food service, get. And I think that's a perfectly great neutral example. That's something that can be provided, and it's there and it's updated regularly. You can ask, how many people are ServSafe certified at a certain level, whether it's food manager or food handler or the allergen certification or any other certification, and that sort of thing. So, tying it to something neutral like that gives you the same information, gives you the same reassurance, but it's a neutral standard, not one that the group is making up.
Okay. And you could even say in your clause, how many people are there at this level, and you guarantee that you will have at least one at whatever level you set for each event. Right. Most venues that I work with require anybody that serves alcohol in any capacity to have tips training. I mean, that's just a job qualification. If you're going to a place that they don't have that, you might be asking some questions.
Right. Sure. Yeah. And that just goes because under the food code and ServSafe, I mean, you have to have one food protection manager on site at all times. So making sure that they have that many people, enough of those people to be there and manage it, but also, and you can ask, what is your regular training protocols that you have now? And because of COVID, when was the last time you did a training? That would actually be a good question to ask, especially when, a lot of people are being furloughed and they might just be coming back, know.
Sure. And another issue that I usually address there is that a lot of times within hotels, or any business, there's usually a 90-day or 30-day grace period, something like that, where new employees have a certain amount of time to get that training. So a lot of times I'll say that for my clients' events, again, I represent the planner, for my clients' events, that the people who work our events will already have that training. Rather than getting the ones who are still awaiting training, again, just so that we have the safest possible event.
That makes really good sense. Now, Lisa, or both of you, last week I told you about a property that I talked to, and their entire culinary staff had been furloughed. And so the general manager, the sales manager, a couple other people went and got their food handler certifications. And when they do, they're hiring a caterer from off property to come in and cater events at their hotel for them, but they're the ones doing the service. But they're also now letting planners bring food in from other caterers. What risk does that put on both sides? Does it? Or what would you think about when you're contracting with property like that?
I mean, obviously these are all new things in light of COVID, but in my experience, when I'm working with a hotel or a venue and somebody wants to bring an outside caterer, we always say our executive staff has to be on site. our executive chef has final say on compliance with food code. And if our chef says you're not doing it, we have the right to stop service or to step in. So the idea that there's a venue saying, gee, we don't have an executive chef and we're bringing in third parties to do that, that would make me nervous, frankly, because somebody has to have the ultimate say as to whether or not people are adhering. And if you're bringing in a different outside caterer for each event because the planner's bringing them in, what control do you have? And that would make me very nervous. And I also think from a liability insurance issue for everybody involved, that creates a lot more risk that I would be worried about.
Yeah, I agree with that. It was, well, and all the time, as contracting things, no outside food and beverage is allowed. And, and granted, this is a very big anomaly of what's happening in our events, but it does raise those concerns. Tyra, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the other thing here is that this is going to make your indemnification clause. You're going to really want to look at how indemnification is going to apply here, because I think a lot of people still, despite I know all of us lawyers who speak to the industry, trying to explain indemnification and beating that drum. I think people still just go, yep, there's an indemnification clause, check, and moving on through it. But this is the kind of situation where indemnification is going to become really important, because indemnification is particularly important when it's a third party, that involved, like this caterer. So you get a contract between the hotel and the group, and then this caterer. So you've got this third party involved. And now what happens if somebody gets sick because of something the caterer did? And, so this is going to become a liability issue, because the group is going to, if some attendee gets a foodborne illness, they're going to sue the group, they're going to sue the hotel, but the caterer is going to be the one that's provided the food. You've got a real liability issue here.
And the question in that case is who is this outside caterer contracting with? Is it the group? Is it the venue? Is it somebody else? And I think something that people don't realize you can do is, when you're presented with these unique situations, you can call your insurance broker and say, hey, this is what we're thinking about doing. Are we going to have insurance issues here? Because if your coverage doesn't cover whatever this is, it doesn't matter what your indemnification clause says, you're going to be in a lot of trouble.
That's a really good point. Yeah. And it's not just about your hotel contracts. It's about what your coverage is as well.
Right. And does that caterer have coverage? And that caterer should have to provide proof of insurance before they walk in the door. Because if they don't have insurance and they can make everybody sick, again, you're out of luck.
Right. Yeah. And I think even without COVID, if you're doing a wedding that you're coming in and kosherizing the kitchen, or you're bringing an Indian caterer in to do your Indian wedding, those are questions that you need to ask as well in general for those venues as well. I think it's not even just COVID specific. Now, when we're talking about kind of going back to that food code, how can, I guess it's just general conversations between the planner and the supplier on, because this last paragraph says, if the provider fails to abide by the food code regulations. And I think that's just really a planner asking, hey, do you have a link to your food code? Or because you don't want to, I guess you could call in the health inspector to come in and check them out, but is that really necessary? It's like the fire marshal.
There's a difference between what your clause says and the practical reality, because this clause says if they fail to abide by the regulations before coming on or while on site, they can terminate the contract. Okay, well, now you've got a meeting with your 500 people showing up and you don't have a contract and you don't have a place to go. That's not the remedy that's going to help you.
Right.
So, you need to think about what your clause is saying, and that just leaves you stuck. So I think that what you should, if you're going to have something in there, it should say, if your score goes below X, you agree that you will sit down with us and come up with an action plan of how you're going to correct the deficiencies that were found on the inspection. That's going to help you. Walking away from your contract isn't. Right, Tyra?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I always tell people you need that hammer, the what if this, then what. but yeah, the remedy's got to make sense. And
Right.
that one doesn't.
Yeah, because if you're in the middle of your event and something goes wrong, you don't have the ability to just move everybody to another property, especially in light of this. Staffing wise, one of the bullets, inadequate staffing behavior. How, Lisa, goes back to what you said earlier, is like, you don't, and both you said, what is that behavior? How have you outlined that? Is that something that we want to put in a hotel contract? And what is inadequate behavior?
Who knows? And therefore, I think it's worthless.
I don't know what that means. And again, that's one of those things that I would tie to something specific. I mean, if they're talking about not having enough servers, per table, are they talking about not having enough bartenders per group? I mean, the Events Industry Council, the Convention Industry Council manual has guidelines for that. But if that's what they mean, then specify. Right. That the event will be staffed at least up to the guidelines set forth in Chapter X of the Convention Industry Council Manual, 9th edition.
And I've seen clauses that say, if we don't like your staff member and we tell you that, you agree to bring in a different staff member. Well, that may not be workable in a union house. There may be no ability to change that. B, they may not have anybody else available because they've all been furloughed and these are the only people that came back. And C, now you're into the situation that Tyra talked about before, that you want to have the same service staff throughout the event, so you're exposing less people. So if somebody is acting in a way that they don't like, you can't just necessarily get somebody else to come in. And everybody has a bad day once in a while.
Right. And figure out some kind of remedy for that. If just take them off the floor or something, get somebody to replace them if you can.
But now you're down a server. So,
Yeah.
Well, and two, I would think even something like that. I've never heard anybody say that one, Lisa, but it sounds like you may have faced that. But but that would seem to open you up too for potentially a discrimination issue where it's, somebody could potentially say, gee, I just don't like that person and that person and that person. And, oh, look at that. We seem to be profiling. So,
yeah, right. Good point. And that has come up.
Yeah.
Okay. So profiling, this is something that came up a couple of months ago. Well, I guess this is actually came up last year, which is, oh my gosh, a year ago. This is dietary needs question, not really around food code, but I was doing a presentation and the planner sent the dietary needs to the caterer. And in that included some kosher necessities. And the legal team of that hosting organization and the planner said, be cautious of sending that list and who gets it because of what's going on right now. Some people might be profiling those individuals who are following kosher or halal dietary practices. So that brings in a GDPR kind of situation there. How can both sides kind of mitigate that information or manage that risk? Who wants to jump in on that first?
Wow. I've never heard the issue phrased that way. That, what times we live in. I guess the way to deal with that is if people have those worries, and I'm sorry that they do, if you're just saying I need 10 kosher meals, but you don't tie them to the individual, and then when the event happens, the individual has a color card or something that says I'm one of those people, so the server knows to bring that, then there wouldn't be a way to profile them.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah.
I would agree to that. And I don't think there's particularly a legal risk here because the person is volunteering the information that they require a kosher meal. Mm-hmm. So I think there's not a legal risk attached to it. They've voluntarily given you that information for the purposes of conveying it to the food provider.
But just what are some good, and I don't want to feel like we're bashing this contract clause because I don't want that perception to come about, but I think there's good ways to go about having this. And I think it comes down to communication between both parties and making it clear, these are our concerns and, what are your concerns or what are your challenges and maybe, what are your current safety practices that you have in place and who oversees them? Besides, adding some of those clauses in, Tyra, that we talked about, asking about how many people are serve safe. And you guys, I'll post that PDF when we're done with this onto the Facebook group so you can see it. Are any other good suggestions around food and beverage and contracting that around safety as well?
I think I shared most of the ones that I had.
Okay.
I think communication is really the key. And so as part of your preparation process is that you need to find out who your contact is at the venue that handles that. And there needs to be regular communication. And, maybe it's because I'm old, but I would rather do all these communications via email or in writing so that we're sure that everybody understands what we're saying, so that you can send an email saying, I have these 10 people that need this, please confirm. And then you've got the confirmation, or what are you going to do about whatever your concern is, so that then you will have that food and beverage portion of your file when you show up, and you can say, okay, remember, these are the things that are about to happen during this event. So everybody's on the same page.
Yeah. And along with that, just sort of redundant communication and repeated communication, because you're never quite sure. And this happens, and I've worked in hotels, so I know how this happens, but you convey it to the salesperson and the convention services person, but you don't know if it gets conveyed to the banquet captain and then the servers and all of that. And, so just making sure it gets on the BEOs, you repeat it in the pre-con, you make sure that you have a way of communicating it, cards or whatever, so that it gets conveyed at the meal. Mistakes still happen, but just making sure that it does get communicated over and over at every level.
And I agree that mistakes do happen. And I think that another thing to think about is, it's one thing to ask your attendees as part of the registration process, are you kosher? Do you require kosher or gluten-free or a generic category of dietary issues? But if somebody has something really special, when we talked last week, we talked about somebody who's allergic to pepper, under the ADA, you are required to give reasonable accommodations. But if somebody came in and said, I can't have any pepper, I would tell my venue to say, I'm sorry, we can't accommodate you, because there's just no way you can get rid of all the pepper in a venue. You just have no idea what's in the food that they buy or their suppliers. So if somebody has something very specific, then you need to have that contact at the venue where you can tell that attendee, here's your contact. You need to talk to the venue personally to tell them that you're allergic to whatever this weird thing is, and get their communication as to whether or not they can or can't accommodate it. And sometimes the answer is going to be no, they can't accommodate it.
Yeah. I was talking to a director of catering and sales this morning, and a couple of chefs, over the last couple of months too. It's like, design your menus that they're free of as many of those dietary needs in general. Pepper would be a really hard one to do. Garlic is a really hard one to do, right? So, but if you've got the top 8 or the top 14, plan your menus without those as much as possible. Only if you have people that are allergic to them. Don't do it just for the sake of doing it. But if you've got somebody allergic to something, see how you can design those menus and make that event and that food and beverage so everybody can eat it. It makes it easier on the back of the house at the same time, as well as in the front.
Venues are getting so much better in the last few years about identifying things, and putting labels on everything. But I remember being at an event where I thought it was very clever. Instead of serving steak, they served a grilled portobello mushroom. And that was the entree. And people did not know what it was. It was just a thing to watch people going, I have no idea what this thing is.
Was it good?
Yeah, it was very good. Yeah. Those who ate it, a lot of people didn't eat it because they didn't know what it was.
Right. Well, yeah, that's a whole nother issue.
They were trying to accommodate everybody with this, vegan entree, and people didn't like it. So.
Right. Yeah. I've heard a couple of vegan trying to feed everybody vegan, and people don't like that. Okay. So before we got on the call, adding this as an addendum, Lisa, you had very strong, do we add this as an addendum? Can it just be a small clause, or do we just have conversations and do it with follow-up emails, like you said? And do those follow-up emails, can they be included in, if something happened, can they be included in, or what's your legal term, as documentation that this was agreed upon?
There's a couple of things here. I hate addenda. negotiate one complete contract. So if you need a clause about food and beverage, put it in the main contract. Don't have a contract and an addenda, and you're just sticking two things together. That doesn't work. In terms of what you agree upon about menus and those kinds of things, your BEOs, if they're signed by everybody, they're an amendment to the contract. But your communications back and forth are not an amendment unless they're signed by both parties. But details of what you're going to do as to how you're going to handle the event, I don't think need to be an official amendment as long as you're just going over the details. Tyra, do you disagree on that?
I think it depends on how important the details are. I think it really does depend on what you're talking about. If it's, anything that's material to the contract needs to be in the contract. But obviously there are going to be things that you're dealing with after the contract's signed. And I think as long as you have, the communications, I think that's okay. But remember that if there's a contract dispute that goes to trial, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa, because you're the trial lawyer, not me, but generally the court looks at the four corners of the document to determine, what is happening. So they're not going to look at necessarily all that external evidence. So, there's that's what your concern is what does it say in the contract?
Well, that's true up to the signing of the contract. So all the discussions you have leading up to the contract are irrelevant. Once you sign the contract, that's your deal, no matter what you said before. Okay. After the contract is signed, when you're hammering out the details of, we're having a banquet for 600, now what are we serving them? And that's in your BEO. That signed BEO is an amendment to the contract if you both sign it. And then when you're getting down to the details of, I need 4 vegan and 6 kosher or whatever, I don't think you have to do a formal amendment to the contract to do that, as long as you said, yes, this was communicated and the hotel acknowledged it.
Okay, I'm so glad you said that word, because it is what I was going to ask you. Is the BEO is another contract? So in all of my presentations, I'm like, that BEO is your food and beverage contract after the hotel venue contract is signed. So it's important to put those details into that, because the other part too, going back to the staffing, is that's what the banquet managers and the servers rely on. How many of us see that BEO coming out of somebody's pocket and them referring to it in the middle of an event? So with that being said, anything that you want to add on, adding to you don't want a 90-page BEO, which I've had before, just for general information about the event, but that's where the details about food and beverage service styles and what's being served can be added. Who wants to answer that first?
Yes, that's absolutely. The BEO is the roadmap of the individual event, and you need to have the menu, the service, the decor, everything on it, and both parties should sign it, because if both parties sign it, that's a formal amendment to the contract and it's binding.
Okay.
But and that's where it's more likely to actually make it happen, because the people who are going to make the service happen are the ones that are going to read that one, not the convention services manager and the sales manager. Right.
Yeah. Because the sales manager is basically the person that sees that contract. They don't see the BEO, and that's the details of that event. Do the two of you have any other thoughts about food and beverage in the light of COVID and contracting?
I think we've covered it.
I think so. I'm hungry and now I want to go eat lunch.
Okay, so what are you going to eat for lunch?
I don't know. I have to go see. Now I want a full-plated lunch. I want somebody to serve it to me on a white tablecloth, but I can't have that.
No, you can't have that at all. Lisa, well, you're not time for lunch. Sure.
It's not. It's only 10:30 here. Too early.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate you both. Both Lisa and Tyra are in the Eating at a Meeting Facebook group, but that does not mean you should barrage them with legal questions.
Because we can't give legal advice that way anyway.
Right. So, but if you have other questions and you want me to bring them back, as we go forward, other things, let me know, or you can reach out to them. And if you're a hotelier, Lisa's your girl or woman or gal or person, and Tyra on the planner's side, she's there for you as well. And she teaches classes as well. And they both speak regularly at industry events. And we got a big thanks, ladies, for this presentation. So thanks, Lisa.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.